So sea lice, relatively low concentrations in nature. This is quite a happy little picture. This guy's only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 or 9. I'll show you a picture in a moment that gives you some idea of what these creatures look like. They are lethal. They will kill young salmon. This is something that the government and the industry don't want to talk about here in BC. In Europe, a huge amount of study has been done of the impact of sea lice. And of course, we have our own Broughton experience where in 2001, some studies began thanks to a very brave young BC scientist, Alex Morton, who some of you may know, who pretty much on her own started looking at what was going on. And regrettably, what she was worried about came to pass. There was a double whammy, and at least part of the whammy came from large numbers of sea lice going on to the young pinks as they came out, and runs of several million were reduced to just over 100,000. So here's an industry that did a huge amount of damage to all of us collectively here in British Columbia, and to date the industry hasn't even apologized, even though the scientific evidence is overwhelming. Here's what they look like. These ones are just near, obviously, a young salmon's eye, and these of course are all, as they come off in streamers and go on to other juvenile salmon or even mature salmon, each of those will turn into another sea louse. And as I said, as few as a half a dozen will kill a juvenile. This just gives you an area where in the Broughton Archipelago the sea lice infestation took place. Record levels were found in the area. We had the huge mortality and 2002 collapse. Again, this is the unfortunate part of what's happening with the industry and why it's good to have lots of people out on a night like this, because we are going to do something about it collectively, is that the days, I think, of letting industry and government just deny these sorts of things are simply over. I'll tell you how we'll go about making that happen. This is the important part of the paradigm and what Daniel was talking about earlier. These super carnivores, they need a pretty healthy diet. So it takes 4 kilograms of wild fish, and at the moment, of course, they're being imported from another part of the world, mostly from off of the coast of South America. But it takes 4 kilograms of those sardines, and if you're interested, next time you're in a shop, buy yourself a can of sardines. It's more than $1 for 3 ounces of sardines. But somehow or other, through the mystery of international trade, you can end up with 1 kilogram of not that great tasting farmed salmon as a result of taking those 4 kilograms and feeding them and getting that 1 kilogram back. And this is really the important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about these little wild fish, is that when you see those earlier pictures of a salmon feedlot here in BC, you better keep in mind that that's really a 50,000 hectare area that's been fenced off. You got to sort of blow it up in your mind and think, how big is that? How big is that really? We have a number of recommendations. There was a moratorium on giving out new licenses. Everybody's friend Gordon Campbell has lifted the moratorium, and the industry is revving up to start spreading up the coast and around Vancouver Island. It's very important that that moratorium be reinstated. The studies that were done now almost 10 years ago that recommended the moratorium, virtually none of the recommendations have been implemented, and the industry has gone ahead and doubled their level of production, even though the principal recommendation was that there was a blinking yellow light or perhaps even a blinking red light at the old levels of production. So here the industry has simply gone ahead and doubled, and now they want to start expanding up the coast without meeting any of the serious problems that had already been produced. The net cage problem is a problem, but it's one that can be solved rather easily with technology, and I'll show you a Sargo cage in a moment. But I don't think we should ever forget, it's the input issue that we really need to confront the industry about. Taking 4 kilograms of perfectly good consumable wild fish, most of which, well, in fact all of which, I prefer sardines or even Inca shad to feedlot salmon. The existing problems haven't been cleaned up, and we have to stop letting the BC government and Victoria say that they're the ones who are running this industry. The federal responsibility is very clear. The constitutional mandate, the legal mandate is all federal, and I think we have to get the federal government to wake up and take the lead. And as I understand, sometime around April Fool's Day, there's going to be a federal election, and lots of us ought to be able to do something about getting at least a few BC members elected who might understand why there should be a federal role leading that. Open, transparent process and dialogue doesn't exist. Enforcement, it's virtually non-existent, even on the killing of pinnipeds. We've been in court for more than 2 years trying to get the federal government just to live up to its basic duties in terms of the killing of pinnipeds. And on the 18th of December, we're back in the Federal Court of Appeal, and I would hope that we'll win that case, but the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the salmon farmers are again fighting desperately to stop their evening entertainment killing these seal and sea lion populations of British Columbia. And obviously we need an ecosystem approach. We've been doing a number of things. This one was actually an ad run in the New York Times. That's right, by CAR. And I'll list for you in a moment all the members of CAR. So there's a lot of organizations in BC that are working very hard now to start doing something about farmed salmon. And the great thing about running this ad, just sort of from an advertising perspective, was the Globe and Mail, when they saw it in the New York Times, they then ran one the same size in their paper. So it was a nice little 2-for-1. This is a hard-sided system. It's basically fiberglass. We went down 5 years ago to Seattle, where they had these in operation. They grew to full-size coho inside this completely closed system. They pumped the water up through a fiberglass filtration system, the same as you have at the Vancouver Aquarium for tropical fish. They took out all the sewage, took the sewage onto the land. They raised the coho to full size, used no drugs and no chemicals in this closed containment system, and actually made money doing it. So you sort of have to ask yourself, you have to do a little bit of scratching and say, oh, why is the industry not doing this? If these guys working with the National Fisheries Marine Service, if they could do it without drugs and without chemicals and without antibiotics and without any escapes, what's going on here? It doesn't resolve the bigger issue of the 4 kilograms of wild fish to make 1 kilogram of fish in here. But I don't think we should let any more buffoons in British Columbia come around and say, well, we just have to have our open nets. The open nets they're using is simply so they make more money. That's all it's about. And all of those other problems I talked to you about, escapes and sea lice and killing of birds and killing of seals and sea lions and sewage, and all of those things can be resolved. And again, this isn't a steep forehead solution. This is not rocket science. This is a floating toilet bowl. Okay? This is not tough stuff to figure out. Okay? It's round and it floats. And we ought to be able to get people that get elected to understand round and floats. That's what we want. These are not really tough issues that we can have trouble communicating.
Is it a cost factor mainly? Is it a cost factor?
Yes, these are expensive, but if you amortize them over time like anything, they'll pay for themselves. They're around $1 million per pod. So they're not cheap.
Compared to?
Well, compared to virtually nothing. Open net cages, if you use relatively inexpensive nets, you're looking at a couple of 100,000 instead of $1 million. So we've got industry promotion by government. You always have to wonder what's going on here. If the government's simply promoting farmed salmon, who's protecting wild salmon? And that's something we have to turn around, and that's what a lot of us here in BC are now working for. We know that there's development at the cost of the environment, but the cost of feedlots is simply too high. They're failing to protect the public resource. They're slowly responding to concerns, but it's really only because of market actions, and I'll talk to you about those in a minute. Greater will to oppose them to reform. And the industry as it is simply not environmentally sustainable. So there's some pretty obvious conclusions that one can come to about this industry and why it's not good for BC. So the moratorium's been lifted. That's with none of the problems having been resolved. Expansion into new sites and the North Coast. But this comes at a time where we really have to mobilize and turn this back around. We simply cannot allow this to expand all over the coast.